Hello everyone. Today me and my teammates Nick, Peyton and Wesley are going to talk about thermal injection. In today's presentation we're going to introduce to you guys the thermal injection method and the types, the three most common types of thermal injection. Then for each type we're going to provide some brief history and some basics and the advantages and the disadvantages, the challenges, and a case study for each type of thermal injection. Then we're gonna give you our conclusion about it. So as petroleum engineers, everybody should know that the crude oil or heavy oil is very difficult to produce, and the thermal injection is a very common method that's used to produce the heavy oil and make it by making it less viscous by injecting heat to raise the temperature and lighten up the fluid. So as you can see here, we inject the heat from the injection well, which give us better flow and basically increase the temperature of our oil, and we can produce it much easier. The three major types of thermal injection are steam-assisted gravity drainage, and the cyclic steam injection or huff and puff, and the in-CO2 combustion. So for the steam-assisted gravity drainage, it has been around since the 1970s. It's basically used to produce the heavy oils and the tar, and in this type it uses both the natural phenomena and the conventional steam flooding to make the oil less viscous. And as we know, the technology in the past 40 years have been improved drastically, so that transformed our this type of thermal injection to make it more efficient. And for the in-situ combustion, this one has been around before the steam-assisted gravity drainage, which is in 1920s, and the first case or the first time it was used was in Canada. And in a nutshell, basically it involves setting about a part of or a portion of the reservoir oil on fire to increase the temperature and make it lighter to produce it, and it does that by injecting oxidizing gas. The last but not least, the cyclic steam injection. This one has been around since the 1950s. It's only used in single well reservoirs, and a good candidate for this type of steam or thermal injection is a well that have highly permeable walls that allow the steam to go through. And now I'm gonna let my friend Peyton.
So I'll go a little bit more in depth with steam-assisted gravity drainage. But before I actually talk about the steam-assisted gravity drainage process, I'd like to go over the actual history of its development and a brief case study that was initially done to kind of prove its methodology early on. So the original methodology was devised in the 1970s by Dr. Roger Butler. And to actually test this idea, Dr. Butler's company, which would be Imperial Oil, formed kind of a pilot project involving 2 injection wells and 2 production wells, and they were deviated vertical wells. And this ultimately resulted in a 20% increase in production as compared to other steam EOR steam flood in similar reservoirs in the area. This also included a near $35 per barrel operating cost. The development of this specific technique at this point in time was very crucial for the tar sands in the area, which would have been, I believe, Cold Lake, Alberta, Canada. Following this test, results have only increased in overall effectiveness, meaning that process have been more streamlined, which decreases overall operating costs. The steam-assisted gravity drainage process is relatively straightforward. However, before actually utilizing the process, there are a few ideas to consider. The first is the type of the reservoir that's actually being dealt with. Two prominent features to look at are high vertical permeability and an impermeable cap rock. High permeability allows for the steam to fully envelop the formation more quickly, and an impermeable cap rock must be included in order to actually halt the advance of the steam's vertical movement, so that it can actually be contained within the reservoir and fully envelop it. So after determining that the reservoir is a good candidate, 2 horizontal wells are drilled roughly 15 to 20 feet apart vertically, making the upper well a steam injection well and the lower well a production well. As steam's initially injected into the reservoir, it'll rapidly expand upward until it reaches the barrier rock, and after this, the steam will begin like a more evenly spread out enveloping process, and your production will kind of level out and be much more predictable. To show that this method actually works in a practical setting, company known as ESO Resources conducted a case study over some of their tar sands assets, and so basically they just wanted to find a means of increasing their production rates and some of these tar sands assets, and they'd already been using steam flooding in the area, but weren't really getting the results that they expected to see. But after implementing this, so they had pre-existing vertical injection wells, and they just decided to drill a 150-foot, basically a deviated vertical right underneath it, and by doing this, they actually saw almost a double in production, as in oil produced to steam injected.
Okay, and I'm here to talk about the history of in-situ combustion. The first case was recorded in Canada in the year 1920 in Fort McMurray, and it took them a while to get back to Fort McMurray, as the second big operation occurred in 1958. But operations have really taken off near that area, with some 30 cases performed in that area. And the reason why it took so long for the second case to happen was they had many casing failures in that area that just led to a lot of problems for them. Here's just the basics of in-situ combustion. You start out with by injecting an oxidizing gas down into the reservoir, and then once you inject it, you then put heaters down to ignite part of that reservoir on fire, and this creates a flood front that should move evenly throughout the reservoir. But this will lower the fluid's viscosity by raising the temperature and allowing for more fluid flow throughout the reservoir. Now, there's one way that I saw, if you inject water, it's a better process, just because water is a better conductor of heat than air. Like, you don't lose as much heat as you're going throughout the reservoir when you inject water. And here's basically a diagram that shows the temperature distribution throughout the reservoir, and also how it moves through a stratigraphic section. And as you can see, the best sort, well, where the heat is the highest is in the combustion zone, and it slowly tapers off the further away you get from the combustion zone, and the closer you get to producing well. And the main case study that I was looking at was just a review of just the oil production in China for this process. Like, they tried to use steam flooding in China, and they just encountered so many problems with just losing heat, transporting steam to the reservoir. And there was rapid declines in production very quickly, and that just wasn't economical for them. And they found that these other EOR processes weren't as thermally efficient. And in depths greater than 1,500 meters, this improved production by 8.4%, which is actually a good bit when you look at just the sheer number of heavy oil reservoirs in China. And they also found this favorable in thin-bedded reservoirs with greater well distance between producers and injectors, because the normal propagation of the flood front doesn't lose as much heat as other processes. And here's some of the challenges that I found of in situ combustion. Number one, if you're injecting within multiple layers of a formation, the injectivity isn't the same throughout every layer, like as with water flooding. And this just leads to a flood front which can become disconnected from itself, which leads to vast problems. And then there's gas fingering going through the oil and causing a breakthrough of the oxidizing gas too early, which is something that you need to plan for. And just the burning of the hydrocarbons will produce CO2. And now here's Wes with cyclic steam injection.
Cyclic steam injection was first developed in the early 50s. The first actual viable commercial use was found in Venezuela. I looked at several commercially viable uses of Huff and Puff in not only Canada, China, Venezuela, and as well as in California. All of which were small fields that were developed very, very close, which didn't have the ability to put in, the 5 spot, the 9 spot, any of the different types of well configurations. With Huff and Puff, you're just basically injecting steam, letting it soak. I've seen as long as 6 weeks of soak time from some of my case studies, especially up in Canada. Obviously, you're losing a lot of heat to the atmosphere in that area. But reservoirs were really all similar. They had to have the thickness over 30 feet. Optimally, it needs to be under 3,000 foot reservoir depth, just because you are losing so much heat to the to your well bore. Oil saturation of over 40%. Viscosity 1,000 to 4,000 centipoise, which is optimal. Obviously, it's been done on lower viscosity oils than that. Permeability of 100 millidarcies, and the optimal recovery is going to be 10 to 40% of your original oil in place. I've seen as low as 2%. I've seen as high as 50%, but the 10 to 40% is really where you're looking at your best recovery. Advantages, again, it's good for those single well areas where you can't get too much infrastructure back into these areas. It also it increases that production for that single well, which again, viable now, it kind of is questionable because there aren't many operators who are doing single wells in an area. The disadvantage is obviously there's a lot of water that you need to create create the steam that you inject down, and it's a large amount of money to have like a steam generator. Steam generators now are getting to the point where they can be trailer mounted and hauled out by a tractor trailer. So I mean, it's possible, but again, that amount of water needed is definitely something to look at.
Okay, so for the conclusion, it's safe to say that in the last century, these three processes of carbon injection have revolutionized the oil and gas industry, and the production of heavy oil is now much easier than it was before, because of these processes that aided the reduction of viscosity of the oil, and throughout the years, the engineers have always continuously improved and tried to update these processes, and making these processes safer is always, for the environment, is always a major priority to everyone and in the gas and oil industry. And and we will still always need to improve these processes and to make them more sustainable and affordable. That's it. Any questions?